Okay. Which like we get in there.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. It's 5 after, so we're gonna respect everyone's time and get started. My name is Kirsten Heiberger, and on behalf of the Center for Rural Affairs, No More Empty Pots, Unidad Maya Pishonishi, the Rural Prosperity Nebraska, and the Heartland Regional Food Business Center, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, online and in person. To kick off our time together, I just wanted to share a brief version of how we all ended up in this room to talk about feeding Omaha Metro with one of the foremost experts on food systems. It started back in 2010 when Nancy Williams, founder of No More Empty Pots, reached out to Mr. Meter to write the 2010 Nebraska Farm and Food Economy Report. And that mighty little report was shared, quoted, and brought to the discussion for 14 years. In 2023, when the Heartland Regional Food Business Center was formed to improve regional food systems resilience, No More Empty Pots was at the table, and they brought Mr. Meter back with them. As the need for updated information became clear, we again looked to Mr. Meter to lead that effort. And he authored not only the 2024 Nebraska Farm and Food Economy Report, but an impressive 10 regional reports for Nebraska as well, giving our local leaders and stakeholders the best available information to inform their work. Feeding Omaha Metro is the first of the regional stakeholder events, and we're thrilled that Ken was able to join us in person to discuss the report findings. Ken Meter is the president of Crossroads Resource Center, a Minneapolis-based organization dedicated to fostering democracy and local self-determination through community-based food systems analysis. As one of the most experienced food systems analysts in the U.S., Mr. Meter brings over 50 years of experience in community capacity building, integrating market analysis, business development, systems thinking, and social concerns. His local economic analyses have promoted local food networks in 155 regions across 42 states, 2 provinces, and 4 tribal nations, demonstrating his commitment to creating sustainable, community-centered approaches to regional food security. His book, Building Community Food Webs, has not only changed the way I approach food systems work, but it has also been hailed as deserving to be included on any food systems syllabus. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce the incomparable Ken Meter.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's really great to be back at Omaha Metro Area. I remember speaking here in 2010, before this building was here, and basically to a very assembled group of people, and was just starting to talk about where this food work could go. And it's really amazing to see the infrastructure, the people, and the vision that's now cranking here in Omaha. So thank you for having me back one more time. I'm going to just highlight some of the findings of the study today, and then some of you submitted some questions earlier, and I'm going to address a few of those at the end of my talk. We also have time for more Q&A after that's done as well. I wanted to kind of start though by pointing out this slide. This is not Omaha, as you know, but I took this picture because it's where it's from the site of my great-grandfather's tombs in Paul, Nebraska. All the great-grandparents I have on my father's side are buried in this one plot. And they were in the first row of the cemetery, so I think they probably had something to do with building the church in the first place. But I like this view of going towards the Missouri River, and it's a place that feels very spiritual to me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but that's, I wanted to start with my own personal story a little bit on this too. Let me wait on the rest of that. Kirsten's also done a great job of talking about my background, but what I want to add is that in addition to having a Nebraska farm heritage, I spent 20 years living in a low-income neighborhood in South Minneapolis, learning on the ground about low-income issues and the reality that people face day to day there. And my strategy was not to do a project, but to really be a neighbor who did whatever could be done to make things better. And not to promise big change, not to really promise really big initiatives, but basically be a presence for improving the community. So I come with that experience as well as some farm experience and my experience with going around the country doing these food studies. It's a really unique heritage, and of course, my father was really upset I did both of these, because he had worked so hard to get out of Nebraska and get into a professional career, so he would not have to face the choices that he faced. But here I am. Kirsten mentioned the work I've done around the country that shows you a map. It's about 5 years old and shows most of the places I've been able to work in the last several years. I think what I want to say about this map is that this has been an incredible education for me, because I've had a chance to visit most of these places where people are like you are gathering in meetings like this to talk about how do we reconfigure this crazy food system we've inherited. And I have learned so much doing that. Hopefully a few people out there have learned from me as well. I like to start by talking about what should a food system accomplish. What's the purpose of having a food system? Because I think we often think about it simply in terms of money. Like how much money did a farmer make, or how much, how wealthy is a chef or whatever, a restaurant owner. And I think it's important that we have kind of a complicated notion of what that is. I would argue that we need food systems that build health, wealth, connection, and capacity in our communities. In neighborhoods of Omaha, in small towns in Nebraska, in very local places. And if we're not building that at the community level, we're often building just an infrastructure that looks good, but doesn't really solve our problems or meet our needs. I can go in depth, I won't take time today, but as you probably know already since you're here, the food system we've inherited is failing on all 4 of these counts. We're building bad health outcomes at considerable expense. We're not giving farmers who raise food for people much income at all. Farmers are often farming at a loss. We're actually getting more disconnected from each other rather than more connected to each other. Where food is probably the main vehicle we have for connecting humanly around eating together, around sharing food together, sharing preparation, and so on. And then we have this beautiful food that comes in nice packaging with great technology, but a lot of us have forgotten what it was like to feed ourselves well or to actually handle food safely. So that's my quick version of that, but I think it's important to talk beyond economics and talk about really what do we need to accomplish to say the system's working well. That said, I also take an economic view of what's going wrong, because that's the language a lot of our policy discussions come in. One of my little speeches is about what we call the supply chain. And I like to start with this because this is a model I've used when I want to calculate the value that a buyer adds to the product that a farmer raises, or if I want to calculate the value added that food service adds. It's a very good model for calculations. It's not the way the world works at all. What's dangerous to me is the word chain, because when we say we're in a chain, we're talking about a system. First of all, it reminds me of slavery. And second of all, it also kind of implies that people on one end can yank the chain for the people on the other end and get them to do what they want to do, which is in fact what's been happening for hundreds of years. And so I like to think about this in a different way. What I do is take this same diagram and put it in a circle, because as a lot of us have learned, a circular diagram is much more powerful and much more inclusive than a linear one. It's the same basic story here, but in this version, organic waste are recycled back into new fertility for farmers. So it becomes more of a loop and more of a circular economy and more of something that really moves us forward in a better way that builds more community wealth. But also in the middle of the circle, we have a bunch of things we don't often talk about. We need good policymakers, we need good researchers, we need good extension agents, we need healthy soil, clean air, clean water. Without those things, this chain does not work, and without those in the middle, the circle does not function well. So I like to think about this as a very different way than the conventional industry really likes to think about it. And I've had people kick me out of the room because I try to say, let's not use the word shade. But I've also had people come back and say that I think that this is really how we have to think about what we do. It's not about being politically correct. It's about getting the outcomes we deserve. And sometimes language really makes a big difference for how we get what kind of rewards we get for our work. The other level of this is that people connect across this circle. So in a healthy food system, some consumers are buying shares in a co-op grocery store so they can help run a store, but also make choices for what the store will carry. They're involved in a conversation, planning for the future of their food. They're not simply going to a store and buying a product. They're involved as co-producers rather than simply as consumers. In a healthy economy, some farmers buy shares in a meat processor so they have a place that's responsive to what they need to do. And the connections like this are just as important as the money that flows through that circle, and just as important as the food that flows through the circle. To me, that's what I call a community food web. It's a set of connections that we weave, when each strand, each strand may be very fragile, but the overall network can really be quite strong and quite effective. So let me go on to, as Kirsten mentioned, this is the, you know what Nebraska looks like, of course, but we broke this into regions. This is where my family migrated in 1870, coming here from both Ohio and from Missouri, when land first was opened up here in Nebraska. And about 1900 or so, my great grandfather concluded that there was no way to make a good living being a farmer, and he, his son, who was supposed to be one of the better farmers in Ottawa County, had always been renting land, never was able to purchase land. He married my great grandmother, hoping, and he would marry my grandmother actually, because her husband had land. She did not want to live on the countryside, so they moved to a small town of population 42. So you could have a social life, but things were pretty raw for farming in those days. At the same time, I've been in the census records show what my family was able to grow in this time, and they could feed themselves off their farm very handily, and they had a lot of ability as a community to take care of their own needs and help each other out. Thank you. Great. I tried drinking water before I started, it didn't work. Right, from the studies we did with Center for Rural Affairs, we broke the state up into CFRA, actually broke the state up into these regions. And also we did reports for each of the tribal nations here. My Omaha study covers these three counties, as you know. So let's start with the population trends in these three counties. Population, this is, I have data going back to 1969. In the last 54 years, populations increased 76%. So more people to buy food and also more mouths to feed. It's kind of a mixed blessing. But you know, it's great to have the population base for lots of things. And I think it's incredible to have that kind of power. Many regions I've studied are losing population, but Omaha region has a very rapidly gaining population. If you look at the economics, the personal income earned by the people who live here, people earn $63 billion a year in the Omaha market. That should be enough money to do quite a bit of good activity, you would think.
Yes.
It's actually quadrupled, 300% increase or quadrupled in my professional lifetime. And it's really, and that's after adjusting for inflation. It's very interesting that we have this much money floating around our community, and we still have so much problems with food security, so many problems with inequality. This is a really remarkable story, but it does suggest that the region has enough money to pay for the food system that we deserve to have here. I'd like to break down I can get data showing how this data breaks down, and this is also a very interesting story because. Well, the number one source of income in the Omaha Metro area, very different than the rest of Nebraska, is capital income from interest, dividend, and rent payments. Now, that's really great. That's about $15 billion coming in. And people don't have to work for it. They get the money because they own something. It's a return on an investment. But it's not something that we do work and get paid. Transfer payments is the second source, largest source of income. Things like unemployment benefits, retirement, pensions, and so on. So SNAP movements are part of this. I'll show you more about that later. Government jobs is number 3. That includes educational institutions such as the universities that we have and the schools we have. And that's a rising force. Healthcare is next, rising very steadily over this time. And to some extent, that's because professionals are getting paid better, and to some extent, it's because we're not as healthy. So it's, again, a mixed story. Finance and insurance is very large. Manufacturing, where we kind of think of the strong economy being where you have manufactured stuff and add new value to that, and that gives you this kind of extra, value added that builds your economy. It's actually a very limited source of income in Omaha today. And it made a little bit of a rise in the last few years, but it's been pretty low the last 50 years. And then professional services is right above that right here. So it's a very different picture. I think, but there's 2 things I want to say. And first thing I'll say is capital income only goes to 20% of the population. I looked up the census figures this morning on the breakfast, and only 20% of the people in the Omaha Metro Area collect this money. So this is a sign of rapid inequality. Our money's coming in to people who are owners, and it is not being shared widely with the rest of the community. I'll say more about transfer payments in a minute. But we'll compare that with farm income in a few spots too. But the next thing I'd like to say is government programs make up 22% of all the income that is earned by people in their households in this region. That's a lot, that's a pretty high dependence on public programs. So for those people in Metro Omaha who think we should get the government out of our lives, be very careful. Because this is clearly a very important source of our livelihoods and our ability to have the lives that we want to have in the future. To look more closely now at poverty issues specifically, 168,000 residents, which is 21% of the population, earn less than 185% of the poverty guideline. I think this is a better measure of a livable wage than the poverty line itself, which is really a very low measure. So if you say 185% is, even that's not a very posh thing, but it's a better measure of what's the poverty line in my view. That's 168,000 people in the Omaha areas, and 1 of every 5 is wondering where money's coming from at some point during the year. The good news is the lower rate than the rest of the state, or than some parts of the rest of the state. So some rural areas actually have more poverty than Omaha does, even though Omaha might get plug and blame for that just because of having a rural population. Food insecurity rates as measured by Feeding America, they do the mapping the meal gap, and they calculate 110,000 residents who are food insecure. So a pretty healthy slice of the people below 185% poverty, and some folks above that line are still food insecure because they're still not sure they may have a family too big, or they have dependents that make it difficult to get the income they'd like to have. That is the data for these 3 counties. I'd like to talk in terms of number of residents rather than 14%, but it's 14%. Because I think it's important to say there's more than 110,000 people out here in these 3 counties that need to be addressed, need to be served. 4% of the region's households earn less than $10,000 a year, which is an unimaginably low income. 31,000 people are living on that kind of income. It's a household income, not personal income. Okay, about $77,000, or maybe about $150 million of SNAP benefits every year. That was in 2022. He's down from the pandemic peak, which is good news. And they averaged about $88 million from 1989 to 2022. So on average, $88 million coming in with SNAP dollars. That may change with federal policies changing. Here's the way the benefits come into the last few years. And as Vanessa was reminding me of a meeting recently, that this is an income benefit. It only goes through food, but it's really not a measure of hunger. It's both a response to hunger perhaps increasing, but also our awareness of hunger going higher. And it's been rising steadily. And I think this rises, this brings the question to my mind, why is basically a farm state having so much need for people to have access to food? And that seems very strange to me. It's also very normal. It's true in most of the regions I've studied, but if there's anywhere in the country it should be possible for local people to feed local residents, it should be places like Nebraska. So I'm really wondering, how come, what does this picture say about the mainstream economy in Omaha? I'll explore that later. Also, for those who are really worried about SNAP dollars being a real drain on the budget, this is the SNAP dollars. That's the same line we just saw, compared with all the transfer payments coming in to the region right now. And nothing against unemployment benefits and pensions that I've got some of those coming in myself right now. But it's a much bigger slice of money than what we're fighting about politically in terms of lazy people getting SNAP dollars. So keep that in mind as well. So this leads me to the question about to what extent could Metro Omaha feed itself? I apologize, I have a Lincoln slide here, not an Omaha slide, but I hope you can tolerate that. Let's look at the market for food in Metro Omaha right now. Consumers in this three-county area buy $2.9 billion worth of food every year. 2.9 billion. It's a pretty hefty market. Yeah. And that might interest the farmer, you think. 1.9 billion of that is for food that people take home to eat. And then this breaks down the different categories of food that people are shopping for. These are all pretty respectable markets. Omaha Metro is a very big metro area. And it's the kind of market that should appeal to farmers as well as food buyers, as well as distributors, to say, let's obviously they have addressed that market, but not in the way we would like. So Feeding America calculates that we would need $79 million more to give everybody the meals that they deserve to have to live in Metro Omaha. And that's out of $2.9 billion, the total market for food. If we increased our food budget by 2.7%, we could have enough money to make sure food boxes go to everybody who's on welfare or everybody in the food banking system. Now, a year ago, if I said 2.7%, people might have really been shocked. Now we're facing much higher price rises because of the economic upheaval we're going through nationally. So this seems like it's a doable phenomenon, although it takes a lot of political will to get there. Also compare that number with, I'm sorry, I had an old, I'm good. $79 million needed to feed all residents. Out of $63 million of aggregate personal income, that comes out to 0.1% of personal income. That is how much we would have to spend to get from where we are today to having everybody having enough food, even if it's coming to a food pantry. It's not a huge shift. In fact, if every resident in the county area bought $5 worth of food every week from some farmer in the three-county area, it would mean $211 million of new income for farmers. And they would get all that income, so if it was purchased directly from the farm, there'd be nobody taking account of that. be a pretty big commercial hit of benefit for those farmers. So let's compare that with what farmers are currently producing. Right now, the farmers in these three counties produce about $358 million of commodities on average every year since 1989. 211 million is a pretty big proportion of that. I'll say more about that soon. They're spending about $324 million to produce those commodities. So they're making a margin of about $34 million a year, which is good news, but it's also growing crops that are used to export out of the area. So we can buy food that was brought in from far away. And that's what doesn't make sense to me. So we divide 1 million, 211 million by 358 million. That's 59% of current cash receipts. If we only took the simple step of buying $5 of food 1 week, each week, all year long. And some people don't buy food for themselves, but someone could buy food for them. It's really, again, not a huge shift, but it could make a big difference what farm income would look like. Curiously, what farmers in the Omaha Metro Area grow is pretty much like what they grow in the rest of the Midwest. Mostly corn, a lot of soybeans. We have this added feature of a lot of nursery and greenhouse production, which guess what? Goes to suburban housing developments, which take more land out of production. So it's kind of self-defeating for farmers to do that, but it's a bigger source of income than raising food for people. And then cattle and cows is relatively small after a very rich heritage of cattle here in Omaha in the early days. Same data in a pie chart for those who like charts. Mostly corn, mostly soybeans, and then when we get down to vegetables, it's a very small slice of that pie. And that seems curious to me in an area where the population is rising so much and income is rising so rapidly. This is the population of animals who currently live in the 3-county area. And I'm not sure how far those animals could go in feeding the 800,000 people we have in the community. But it's worth asking why we ship all those cattle and all those things away and then import meat from somewhere else. So I promised to look at the farm economy in Metro Omaha. And this is the last 54 years of farm production. The orange line of this chart shows how much farmers have earned selling their products since 1969. The maroon line shows how much they spent buying the inputs needed to grow those products. So you see, quite a bit of growth in sales. But every time farmers make a little bit more sales, the production industry or the production suppliers, the input dealers, the equipment dealers, the seed suppliers come in and raise their prices or sell them some more. So basically, everybody's been doing better and better over time, but the head income for farmers has not changed all that much. It was pretty much steady from 1969 to 2006. It had a little peak in 2012, which I can't totally understand. It's very different. Most regions I've studied have not had that. But then it fell down back down below zero and an unusually good year in 2021 and 2022. But what's interesting here is for all the growth in farm production, not much improvement for farm income. But this is only one way to look at that data. It's very important to take into the fact that the value of the dollar is now 8 times weaker than it was in 1969 when the chart started. So I'd like to take this data and adjust it for inflation just to show what that looks like in 2022 dollars. Now you see that sales have actually declined over time and production expenses have actually declined over time. Now to some extent that's because farmers have left farming. It's been a big shift in the industry, also more later. But you notice that not only is net income pretty much holding steady, in fact, it's $44 million less today than it was in 1969. After doubling productivity for farmers, after all the new equipment and all the new technical expertise and research we have at our disposal. This is mostly, I think, because farmers have left farming as development took over farmland, but it's still very common in the regions that I studied that farm income is lower today than it was 50 years ago. The next chart shows why this has changed. This is income from livestock in the blue line compared with income from crops in the green line. What's really changed in the Omaha region is very many fewer cattle being raised, much less money being raised. Cattle prices are higher now than they were 50 years ago too. So cattle prices are higher, but the income is much lower. As we saw in the last chart, income really peaked in 1973 during the oil OPEC energy crisis, when we were trading American wheat largely to the Soviet Union in exchange for them buying our wheat in dollars so we could bring our dollar supply back, because we were spending so many dollars buying oil from the Middle East. And that was really what fueled the most prosperous time in agriculture in the Omaha Metro region. Was a international crisis that worked to our benefit for a couple of years. Well, after 2 years, that fell off very rapidly. Production expenses shows the same trend. I don't have to go on this, but this is how many livestock have been purchased, livestock feed. Those have declined as people have moved out of cattle production. I remember coming to Omaha and about the start time this chart was started. And Omaha pretty much smelled like manure at that time, because it was a huge feedlot in South Omaha, around, I guess it was around 30th Street and L between L and Q. And I was blown away. I'd never seen so many cattle, and I'd never smelled so much cattle at one time in my life. But I had very vivid memories of driving past them on the highway. But that's all gone now. And as a result of that, a lot less, the cattle production's moved elsewhere. Some cases further west in Nebraska itself. But it's been a dramatic change to how we think about life in Omaha. You could argue this is better for Omaha because we can make more money in non-farming activity, but that doesn't answer why farming can't be a financially viable activity. And that's a social political discussion. It's not strictly an economic one. These are the three main forms of net income for farmers. The red line is the same one you saw before. It's the income you earn by producing crops and livestock. The blue line is a formulated income. When the blue line is higher than the red line, you know that it's more lucrative for a farm owner to rent out their land to someone else and let them take the risk and to actually work the land themselves. When in this case, doesn't happen very often, but when government programs are the top line, it means government income is the #1 source of net income for the farm sector in these 3 counties. It's not the story we'd like to tell about our farm sector, and I think that's what the data shows pretty reliably. One of the factors here is, I'm sorry, I left Washington County, this is around another time of the day, but for Douglas and Sarpy counties, 57% of the farmland has been lost. A huge bite from development. And again, I question the priorities of why would we, when population is rising and income is rising so fast, why would we let go of our ability to feed ourselves? Why would we think that's a good thing to do? Why would we plan new subdivisions without rushing to where's the food going to come from to feed those residents who come in? And this is also a dramatic part of the story. So that's basically all I want to talk about today. Kirsten and Vanessa put together some questions from you folks who have registered. And I'll start by addressing those just to get us going, but then we can take on others as we have a chance. One person asked if I've worked with blue corn, and I have not. But I would say that Oneida Nation up in the state located in Wisconsin is developing a bill simply they can bill white corn for traditional ceremonies or traditional foods. They're pretty happy to share information. So anybody who's working with blue corn, it'd be good to talk with them and talk about what other blue corn initiatives they know about and how they're working with white corn and with their mills to do what they do. There are several small mills around the country who are making masa, so you can have great tortillas instead of good tortillas. And again, that can happen very easily at a local mill level. Now, whole grain milling in Welcome, Minnesota has blue corn chips that they sell along with very high lysine corn chips. They're usually pretty happy to talk to people who let them do. So those would be 3 sources of information for that. What data do I use? I try to give a source for every slide about what it is. If any questions, I'm happy to talk about where that data comes from. And one little rant I say is too that the data I rely on, most of this data has now been pulled down by the federal government.
Yes.
The Bureau of Economic Analysis no longer reports farm income data for either the state or for the counties. And so I will not be able to tell this story past 2022 unless we get better federal policy. The transfer payment data is no longer published by Bureau of Economic Analysis at the county level or the state level. So we're now losing our ability to even understand what's going on. And that means we're more prone to these kind of wild conspiracy theories and wild notions of what we think is happening rather than being able to ground our work in true data. Composting does play a role, and I mentioned that in my circle diagram, basically that I think it's really important to be recycling organic waste as a new fertility. So that would be my quick response to that question. So one person asked, what's my scenario for food insecurity in 5 years? And that's a really huge question. And I don't have an answer for this. I can dream about it, but I think, I think what really seems to work for people is being connected and belonging and really taking care of each other. Most farmers, if they have surplus food, they'll give it to a neighbor who needs something to eat. Hunger is always a political problem. It's never a problem of personal failure. We've always had more than enough food in this country, but we often don't allow people to get it. So I noticed in both Omaha and my hometown of Minneapolis, drivers are more competitive. You can tell that people are, I can break the law anytime I want to, because I can get away with it, no one's gonna be there to force it. And so we're getting this competitive climate of, I can do whatever I want to do to get ahead and others be wary of me. That's not gonna help us solve food insecurity, really. If we have cutbacks in Medicare, Medicaid, more people will be vulnerable, more people will need food, will not have money to buy for themselves. If we continue to give tax breaks to the wealthy, we'll continue to have more inequality as capital income rises. If we have foreign policy that favors a commodity lobby instead of favoring people eating for themselves and growing their own food, which we have, that will make it worse. So the current environment looks very dismal for food insecurity. It looks like a growth industry, really, because it seems like we're going to have more and more of that happening over the years. I think one simple step that people can take, this program has some limitations, but it's done some wonderful things. The local food purchasing assistance program, which was federal money, was cut off last year. But the federal money allows, it goes to local states who then has not a local nonprofits who then buy food from local farms to give away to food banks and so on. There's a lot of things that doesn't do, but it's a very effective program for getting money in the hands of farmers. It gives people a chance to work together to say, okay, I've got food, I need to buy food. Let's talk together, let's make some deals. It brings people together in a new conversation that we haven't had. So for those reasons, it's a wonderful program. What it doesn't do is fund changing the food system. It only says, oh, if you get a box of food, we're happy. And that's not my ultimate answer, but it's a good first thing. But one question would be, can Nebraska find money to replace these lost federal dollars? There's something like that happen in the future. That would help. It would help temper some of these problems. We could also expand urban agriculture and food processing so that people learn where their food is grown, they know how to process their food, they work together to make enough meals a week at a time, and they come together to kind of help each other through the hard times. That kind of extended program could be very effective. other ways of urban-rural cooperation or rural urban neighborhood. Sits down with a farmer or a group of farmers and say, how do we collaborate so that you bring your food and us and we do something to help you with chores or with investment or whatever. Any of those programs can work really well. And then the alternative to doing any of this is we start having fights over food and we can have Hunger Games scenarios left to right very easily, I think, given how violent our culture is and how isolated we become. So, I mean, I don't want to be Debbie Downer necessarily, but I think it could get really bad. And it's up to us about what we do and how we can maintain our optimism and keep the right things happening. Someone else might ask what collaborations have worked at Omaha to address food insecurity. You folks know that better than I do. So you can tell each other what's worked well here. We can talk about more about it later. How do we encourage more people to grow more of their food? I guess the story I tell there would be, I was up in Alaska in 1982 doing research on what people were doing about local food in Alaska, which is a very challenging environment. Only 750 farms in the state of Alaska. And there was a federal program that helped people build greenhouses. Actually, it's more formal than hoop houses. It's not as big as greenhouses. It's basically a little incubator shed. And about 30 people in the bush got these incubator sheds. And after 3 years of using it, they became storage areas because people put their cardboard boxes in there because although they had the technology, they didn't have the social reason to do it. They didn't have the ongoing encouragement to do it. They didn't have the programming to make that an integral part of their lives. So it became, we have a shed out back. And that's where you put our surplus stuff. So this is important. It's not important simply to have a new technology. It's important to have the social process with that, to really support that. And I think what's really lacking is a sense of belonging. If you're saying, I'm growing my own lettuce, it's easy to say, well, I'm going to go to the store this year. But if my neighbors depending on my lettuce, and if I feel like I belong to a community something greater than myself, it's much harder to let go of that production. And I've talked with some people now about how do we make this work we do, make people feel like they belong to something. It's really going to go for years and years with as our lives move forward. Someone asked about farmland issues, a huge topic, and there's a new book out by the Farmers Land Trust addressing this. I'm not an expert in this, and I have some thoughts about it, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But I think obviously, if families cannot retain ownership of land, it becomes harder and harder to sell hunger because once it becomes corporatized and institutionalized, the people who only care about money take over more and more. And technology is often the main way of getting in the way, the main vehicle for getting in the way of us making these transactions for ourselves. Okay, that's all I want to talk about right now. Happy to talk about any comments, questions, anything else you'd like to bring up this. Yeah.
We're gonna bring a microphone around, if you don't mind speaking into the microphone, and then the folks on Zoom will be able to hear the questions as well. Yeah, up to your chin a little.
You what about system? What do you call production? It's a group of local landowners and farmers, gardeners, who work together, the landowners, at least for one farmer. So we get some economies. Develop farmer-owned brands to sell at local grocery stores. Have you heard of that model? Very local, very regional. I'm not talking about like organic farms that ships in here. I'm talking about building on the brands.
That's a great idea. I mean, I think every step you take that says we own this product and we are negotiating on our own terms and we're collaborating, every step like that is very beneficial. I think the limit of that is to what extent consumers feel like it's another product on the shelf. And what extent they actually sit down and come to your farm and say, I want to know you and I want to really be supporting you and your family. And the dilemma of this, it's a very good idea that often consumers don't get because we haven't done the other work.
Those connections have to be very local, very personal, very visible on the end caps in the grocery store and in the meat cave and in the produce. So they have to be able to know where their food comes from, farm by farm by farm. And with our modern technology, what do you call it? AI, I forgot what that stands for, but anyway, that will help.
Well, but I also know some people who own AI who say, as long as I can tell you which farm that came from, it's local. And so, and I literally spoke with a guy who owned a food hub in Virginia, and he said, pretty soon I'll be able to ship local food anywhere in the US within 24 hours. And he said it was local because he could tell me which farm it came from, he could tell me which field it was harvested from. But that's not what I mean, like, you know.
Yeah, that's not all bad, because we have to ship food out in order to pay for what we're doing now. Although I'm organic, regenerative, natural, whatever you wanna call it. If I don't have organic commodity markets that are big enough to help me pay for taxes, farming, okay? So we have to work both sides of that street all at the same time.
We do, and we have so many shifts we have to make, and we have to take small steps, and they get bigger over time, but it's really a confusing process all around, I totally agree. Lori Tatroger can tell you a great story about asparagus in Iowa sometime, I don't know if we wanna do that now, but, I mean, it's in my book actually, but there's, you want to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you can tell us where I can tell it, so.
Yeah, I'll try to remember back in those days. So Whole Foods, of course, made a big play to buy local from farmers and was working with a group in Iowa, Sioux City area. And they brought their beautiful asparagus in. We had it on a display, but then they also brought in the regional or the national asparagus that was cheaper because there was a disconnect happening within the organization. So you have to make sure that everybody is on the same page and understands the benefit and can support the local and take a chance on that rather than always doing the same thing before it's done. Is that close enough to it?
Well, that's very good. That's better than I could do. What I would add to your story is that when her bosses told her to put the competing asparagus on the shelf, the consumers bought the local stuff, even though it was more expensive, because they cared about the farmers.
Yeah.
Without that kind of sense of loyalty to the picture, you can't really make this work.
But we needed the story on the shelf, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Laura. Certainly.
I have one from the online. Our online folks has a question here. She's curious if you're aware of any communities that have identified a systems-focused organization to help uplift and support evidence-based practices in food insecurity work and share data metrics and analysis. This seems to be missing specifically in the Omaha Metro Area. She said there is a collective of funders conducting a study to try and learn about how this type of systems work or measurement is taking place in other communities. But do you know of any examples, Ken?
Well, there's examples all over the country. Like I missed one of my slides, but the place that I think has done the most interesting job of putting metrics together is San Diego. And they have a whole dashboard where they have a bunch of data on a website, and you can look at a dashboard and see kind of the pulse of what they're doing as a system. But I think it's really strong. So, and there's a lot of places I haven't been, and a lot of places I don't know, but in my experience, what really drives that to be really interesting is that they had a very inclusive process to design that system. So they went out to urban neighborhoods of various ethnicities and got people coming forward with what they need, and putting a very good social process together that was inclusive and making sure people felt safe expressing what they needed in very different ways, and then putting that in their data stream. I think without that social process, the data stream can be oppressive. And it's often used by the people who know technology more than by the folks. It also represents the interests of the people who write the programs more than it actually showing the needs that people have in the community. I'm not sure what's that's addressing food insecurity, but it's been a very robust effort to get a very wonderful, thorough conversation going together about, getting people together to look for a really broad vision for where the food system needs to go, and then having good data to back it up. I think a lot of cities have built data platforms so they can point to and say, our website is taking care of that, our local food coordinators taking care of that, and that's all they do. So I'd be curious to ask those questions about any data platform. Toronto had a very strong food security initiative a number of years ago. I think the person who really was the visionary making that happen has passed away, and I'm not sure to what extent that keeps going in his absence. But at the same time, it was also about a political process where they mobilized residents to care about food and care about food security. And they had a voting bloc and assisted the city of Toronto through planning for a local food system in the future. And it's really about building a constituency. One of the problems cities governments have in addressing this issue is this is not a popular thing. It doesn't make the media very well. It's not always visible. All these steps we talked about, there's some you could make a mistake. You're doing something outside of conventional patterns. It's very risky politically for political leaders to take those steps, partly because of the risk and partly because they're in office for 2 or 4 years, and then someone else might be there. So it's very hard to move this forward at a political level first. It really comes from groups like Omaha Metro and groups who are based in the community who have that longer term lasting power to have a longer term commitment to a set of visions and values. And then they can force city government to really kind of come around and take a more active role.
Thank you.
And the other example I wanted to bring out, I think this is not a data example, but the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil did a very comprehensive work on poverty under Lula's first presidency in Brazil. This was funded in large part with federal money from the federal government in Brazil, but also had a local leadership that was very solid. They realized that to solve hunger, they had to do a multifaceted approach. So they had nutrition education for single mothers primarily. They had incentives and coupons that people could get, some were over coupons, some were over coupons that could allow people to purchase food. They set up stores they called ABC stores, which were very low overhead, but very high quality produce stores that were serving food from local farms. And they also had a variety of programs to kind of help people ground themselves out of poverty. The most visible manifestation of that was what they call a popular restaurant, which is a city-owned restaurant that served a very ample, nutritious meal for about 50 cents. Which is a lot of money in Brazil, but it's probably like charging about $5 for a meal here today. And the meals were so good that office workers from professional offices would come over and eat there because it's the best place to eat. And because of that, it became a culture ground where the people who were lower wealth were not stigmatized or marginalized, but they were meeting and rubbing shoulders with people who had daily jobs. So it became this incredible community gathering point. And I think that I was able in 2010 to bring that like delegation from Brazil up to the Committee for Security Coalition Conference. And what they said was, if we take these programs out, the whole thing fails. We have to do it all. The restaurant's nice, but if we don't have another programming for that, it goes away. And testimony that was 14 other restaurants were started by corporate people in Brazil because the model was so good and they didn't work. Because they didn't have the community genuineness, they didn't have the community background, but backing that, and people saw it was an effort to make money, not an effort to serve the community. So I think efforts like that are thinking of a very holistic way and saying, what 5 or 6 programs do we need to do at one time to get where we want to go are really critical, rather than saying, oh, there's a shiny outfit, we can build a new restaurant. It'll be fun.
Thank you.
And a question here too.
So Contemporary News, we cover like tech innovations going around the state. So like, at UNL, we have the Combine where they're making big ag tech developments. And you ended the kind of presentation talking about like some of the barriers that also are created through the technology, especially kind of AI. So can you talk about like where tech advancements are like, you know, maybe going to solve these problems, but where tech advancements are also perhaps creating problems?
Great question. Technology is really part of the answer. And we're saddled with a lot of technology that gets in the way right now. I also think in America, we kind of worship technology. And in my book, I talk about what I like to do is sort of oppose culture and technology. Because culture is the way that we have of encoding what we learned from our great grandparents, what we learned from farming 40, 50 years ago, what we learned about getting along with each other. That's a technology that's own, but it's something that we develop for ourselves, and it's something that we have a lot of ownership over. Whereas technology is owned by someone else and limits our choices or gives other people control over our choices, is what I think it's questionable. So the one test I have is basically, could we develop a culture of collaboration instead of having a new tool? You could have a big impact if a lot of people do small things together in the same coordinated way, or you can have one big thing that looks fancy, which is better. And you don't always know the answer to that until you try it or you do some measurements. I'm not saying they're both bad. I'm just saying that you have to make choose those between those options carefully. My favorite story about this conflict, or this kind of duality, I think, between culture and technology is the Amish. David Klein is an Amish farmer in East Central Ohio. And he's made his mission as an Amish farmer to talk with English people about Amish myths. And he told me a story about his community. He's a fairly liberal Amish community, but Bishop is liberal and allows certain things to happen. In his community, the elders meet every Wednesday night and they talk about what's coming up in the community. They're mostly farmers. He said the most common topic of those discussions is new technology. Every time a new tool comes in, we sit down and say, can we drive this tool or does it drive us? And that's a very simple-minded way to ask a very valid question. So, you know, a lot of Amish people will not own cars because they feel that's a technology that we can't control, but they're happy to take a trade because they can do that on their own terms. What David is doing, he's a farmer who never bought any, he doesn't have electricity. He farms on horses. He told this wonderful story at a meeting I saw him 20 years ago. He said, I had a midlife crisis. I had to have a new plow. I didn't really need a new plow, but I wanted to get a new plow. And he bought one from Norway. And he had it brought in. He had a choice of 8 blacksmiths who could take that plow and make it from a machine-driven plow to a horse-drawn plow. And he said, I didn't know it was so smooth on Smithfield. I love working with him. His son is right next door to him with a bobcat and electricity, because the community said, for you to start your farm, you need that equipment. We can't keep you to the old ways. But his father, even, is running the old ways very properly because he started farming anytime he could do that. But they have a community process that says, is this good for us or not? And they can reject the technology. It's almost impossible in America to say no to any technology. So I think that's a great example of people turning that over in a very righteous way. You may have noticed, Amish is some of the few people who can pay cash for farms. So I think it's a very robust way to think about this, even in current conditions.
Yeah, we're the same place. You know what these two farmers, father and son, were they selling commodities, any kind of finished product, what kind of products, and which one? If you remember.
I believe they're selling cash grains. But David, the father, had about a 14 cover crop rotation that he was using his land with, very rich and very well established, and he had incredible soil, and he was taking care of it very well. He wasn't getting compaction from the equipment. So he had a very well established system that was in place. And his son, I think, was also selling commodities. But You know, but I think he had more mechanization because the decision was made that without that mechanization, you couldn't get the scale to sell a product. And these are kind of decisions that get forced upon us more than something we get to choose. There's a guy in that committee who brokers produce. And I called him for an interview one day and he never answers the phone. And his way of maintaining technology, control the technology is when you call him, he calls you right back. He calls you on his terms. He had a cell phone, you know, but he was not using it in a way that made him more nervous. It's,
Thanks again. I have a question about one of the slides, because I'm not sure that I understand it. It was one that had $79 million annually, is what's needed for, to improve food security and make sure everyone within that area has food. And what I was, curious about, is that one time or is that annually? Annually, okay. And then as we are doing holistic economic development things in community, that number should be ticking down, so it takes less money each year because we have fewer people that are food insecure. Is that the notion?
well, it could, I mean, you know, this is a very simple line account.
Uh-huh,
You know, it's feeding America, their interest is simply saying, if we had $79 million more a year, we could give everybody in our county who's food insecure a meal box 3 times a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So it's a very limited form of success. But you know, with that $79 million, feeding America calculates, at least everyone would have basic access to food all the time. But then that doesn't mean, you know, doesn't suggest that it's grown in neighborhoods. Doesn't suggest that farmers are connecting with low income people, doesn't make all the social things happen.
exactly.
And you're right, the more we do of that, that number should go down a lot. But, you know, that's tough long-term work too.
It is. Thank you. I also have one other comment, and that I appreciate the belonging and the culture, because we know that that's the thing that drives almost all kinds of change. And in the recent, session with Omaha and the Port Authority, talking about, the innovation district that's coming, with the funds that are, I think it's like 30 million that's being designated as part of the pool of funds that will be needed for this. And every small group report out, I'm not sure if all was there, but in every small group report out, there's a mention of local food, food security, growing home food in some capacity. So I think that there might be a good opportunity to connect with Eric Clark, who's the new executive director. He's new to town in his job, so that we can make some noise and get our friends to make some noise to say, hey, while you're doing this thing, here's an opportunity to build some of these things into it. So that's a nudge to action rather than a call to action, that we can sooner than later help catalyze the things that are already in place.
If I can really leverage your comment, your wonderful comment a little bit too, I think, as you know very well, and I think most people know very well, I didn't really emphasize in my speech, but the answer to food insecurity is not boxes of food. It's about people knowing how to grow food. It's about people connecting around growing food. It's about neighborhoods having enough food to feed themselves, having greenhouse production and everything. So it's, you know, and there's been research showing that for, I was aware of it 2 years ago, and I'm sure there's more since then, but, you know, the answer is really about people having the capacity to know how to grow food and know how to handle it safely, and having those mechanisms and infrastructure and relationships in place. It's not, we don't want to stop and having everybody having a box of handouts. But that's a good first step.
I just wanted to add a small detail. Feeding America equates a meal. 1.2 pounds is a meal for 1 person.
Well,
Thank you.
Many times the cost of industrial agriculture has some subsidies that are go often unaccounted for, things like the cost of carbon to ship at 1,500 miles to Omaha. What are some of the policies? What are some of the metrics that we really need to think about to kind of level the playing field to kind of offset the cost of shipping that all over the world?
Great question too. I think the biggest elephant in the room that I didn't talk about much, but you mentioned the combines that people have to have. $400,000 combine, and I met a farmer in Indiana who was able to write off the total value of that every year. Use it for 2 seasons of 2 seasons of harvest. We call it a 1-year purchase. Tax policy is much more important than farm policy, farm subsidies, in dictating our choices.
Yeah.
Because if we had a different tax policy, if we had a tax policy incentivize local food instead of one that incentivize shipping food long distances. If we had a tax policy that was transparent, so we knew our neighbors were getting a big tax rate, if we were not allowing people to become millionaires, then we would have a whole different set of opportunities.
Is there anything that's currently happening now that is preventing us from really, I mean, are there policies that will keep us from offsetting this costs to the environment?
Well, I think what's, there's a lot of political forces make that a hard question to answer right now, and I don't want to get too far into that right now, but it's actually quite difficult to measure accurately what's the external cost of the environment. It's hard to get a hard number on it, and one of the advantages the commodity system has is you can say, okay, a bushel of corn costs this much, and I paid this much, and that's a very concrete, traceable transaction. The reason for commodity agriculture is that you can be sitting in Abu Dhabi and buy number 2 corn, knowing it's the same quality basically as any corn you get anywhere in the world. The reason you have a commodity system is so you can have impersonal long distance trading. That does not need to be subsidized. Even though I would say the farmers who engage in that need some financial subsidy to compensate for the extractive economy that they're working in. But part of the problem is that you can't tell if preventive medicine works or not. You only know they got sick or not. You can't really measure all these intangible things about environmental benefits as precisely as the stuff that we like to have our political conversations about. I would, my argument would be, I think that the federal government should really be focused on doing more local food persistence programs where you're basically putting money into a community to solve its own problems. And you're putting a big chunk of money and saying, we need to make a transition, we'll give you the resource to do that, but you have to make the relationships happen and have the vision happen. Get the people lined up to go that direction. And you really talk about maybe measuring how much food that was consumed in that community came from local farms. That's a measurement that can be tangible. But you don't ask farms to say, well, we displaced this much of our CO2 production, because that's, first of all, it's not a very intuitive number. And I don't think the results are ever going to be as concrete and robust as what we have in our political conversations today.
Thank you.
Follow on about technology. I'll give you a quick example. Average corn beef guys, gals, maybe $1,000 an acre. I got cows on $1 a head. It's my rent the pasture. I can make maybe $275, $250 per acre. So that differential, although my costs are very low, I gotta be able to sell that beef locally at a pretty good profit, cover taxes and my operating expenses. So that the biggest thing I heard was at a meeting this winter here in Omaha bunch of regenerative growers talking about farm policy. It was part of the conversation. One guy said we need to get rid of crop insurance for corn and bean growers. The audience, there was probably 300 people, and they stood up and clapped.
Wow. That's good news. And I have a similar story I have from another state. I won't say which state it was, but a western state. And I was talking with grain growers about a local grain milling industry, and the owner of a grain milling company said he thinks the farmers in his network realize that the future of farming is smaller farms than the farms that are operating today. And I think there's this realization kind of growing out there. And that's really wonderful to see, but we're also a long way from talking about that.
Probably all the time for the next one. No, just wrap it up. I can't hear you, sorry. Where's that time?
Okay.
Yeah.
Last question.
Just want to thank everyone for coming on comments.
All right, we are. Hello. I don't know if it's actually working at the moment.
Grab pens, maybe.
It was? Oh, okay. I'm gonna steal yours anyways.
There you go.
I hear myself much better. All right, we are at time. Thank you all so much for being here. We are going to break out. We have some snacks out in the hallway, and you all are invited to go through a self-guided tour. We also have another event that's starting at 3 o'clock downstairs in our distribution center. So if you're staying for that buyer meet and greet, we'll be meeting back up right at 3 o'clock down in the distribution center. Otherwise, thanks again for coming. We'll thank Ken one more time.
Thanks to you for a great discussion. I really love your suggestions that they put in. I learned a lot by having talks like this with people like you. Thank you.